your camera off. Okay. All right. Well, hey everybody. It's so good to see you all here. We just don't get to see each other enough, or maybe I don't get to see y'all enough. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight. We have a great program tonight for September, moving our way into our November election. And I just want to offer, if anybody is new and attending Common Purpose for the first time, I want to just offer you a special welcome. And we're so glad you're here, and hopefully we'll see you again in the future. If you're new and you're not on our email list, I want to suggest that you use the chat feature of Zoom and send your email to our attendance taker, which is Tom Wilson, which he's to my left, but it might not be that way for y'all. So just use Tom Wilson and send your email, and we'll add you to our email list. And we send about 2 to 3 emails a month with reminders and topics for our next meeting, as well as the Zoom link. And then after each meeting, we send out a resource page, which has all sorts of information where you can go for additional information if you want to follow up. Michelle's already mentioned, but this portion of our meeting, the first portion of our meeting, is being recorded, just to let you know about that. And the other thing I wanted to offer is just a brief overview of how the format works. If anybody is new, for those of you that have been here before, you'll know how this goes. But we have a great speaker tonight, and he is going to be presenting his talk. And after he wraps up, we'll have a brief Q&A. And I will ask you that if you have any questions for our speaker, Alan Yarborough, to send them again via the chat function to Carlton. Do you want to raise your hand, Carlton, and wave? It says question facilitator for him, so you can use the chat feature, send him your questions, and he'll collect those and use that as a Q&A period for Alan when he is finished with that. And after our Q&A time, we have sort of the second half of our meeting, which is really central to our core beliefs at Common Purpose, which is our confidential and small discussion groups. Michelle will break us into discussion groups. Each one will have a facilitator from the Common Purpose planning team. And just to reassure you, that portion is not being recorded. So it is confidential. And this is where we have a chance to process what we've heard with our speaker, where we have a chance to listen respectfully to one another, and where we have a chance to respectfully share our experiences and our thoughts and opinions with each other. And in short, it's a chance to practice civil discourse, which is a core belief of Common Purpose. And if you look around, you just don't see that occurring very much in the world today. So it's a great opportunity to put that into practice and learn how to go out in the world and share it more often than we often see it. After we have our small groups, Michelle's going to bring us all back together, and we'll wrap up with announcements, and we'll end up with a closing prayer. So that's kind of the format of the evening. We'll be here till somewhere between 8:15 and 8:30 is when we will wrap up. So without further ado, let's go ahead and have our opening prayer. Karen, would you offer that for us, please?
Yes. And let me give credit to Richard Rohr for a few of these words that I have borrowed. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
In the gift of this day, may we each remember and give thanks that your unconditional love comes to each one of us at all times. And in the gift of this present moment, may we give thanks, remembering that your justice is restorative justice. And in the gift of our baptism, may we also give thanks that you love each one of us, wanting for us wholeness of life and spirit. May God be with us this night, opening our hearts and minds, working through us and guiding us each day. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Karen. So I'd like now to introduce our speaker for tonight's session. And if you know me, you will know that not that anybody does, but I'm one of those people that doesn't say anything positive about this current pandemic and this current time. I don't find a lot of silver linings. I tend to fuss about it quite a bit. But tonight I have a positive from the pandemic. And that is the fact that because we're meeting via Zoom, we can now have speakers from outside of our local area. And we have the opportunity to have a national speaker like Alan, who plays a role in helping shape the discussion of political issues throughout the whole Episcopal Church. So let me tell you a little bit about Alan. Alan Yarborough is the Church Relations Officer with the Office of Government Relations of the Episcopal Church. He is primarily responsible for the maintenance and growth of the Episcopal Public Policy Network and the resources aimed at educating, equipping, and engaging the church in policy advocacy, including the 2020 census and election engagement, as well as civil discourse. Alan has lived and worked in Haiti with the Young Adult Service Corps, which is a ministry of the Episcopal Church. He spent 2 years in Cannes working in economic development and communication, and 1 year in Cap Haitian with the St. Barnabas Agriculture Center as a project manager for their revitalization program. He holds a BS in economics from Clemson University, right up the road in South Carolina. So he's a neighbor as well. Well, he'd be a neighbor wherever he is. Anyway, thank you, Alan, so much for joining us, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you, Lee, and thank you all for having me with you all this evening. I am originally from the Carolinas. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, but went to school south of that border. And then I think I'm the only person in my family that is living outside of the Carolinas right now, up here in Maryland, in the DC area. But really grateful for the opportunity to speak to you about advocacy, about politics and the election, and how the church is involved, how you as the church can be involved in this work. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully, with some slides on it, and just sort of want to here we go. Want to clarify that this is it's going to be a wide lens in a way for this advocacy work and election engagement work. And so if there are details you're curious about, a path that I haven't gone down that you want to learn, where you want to learn more, know that our office and myself, we're here as a resource for you all in this work. So even beyond this presentation, beyond this evening, please keep the conversation open as needed, as you're curious about how we go about this and how you can join in. So here to talk about voting and advocacy, I'm going to take a couple of different angles on this to hopefully give you a sense of what the Office of Government Relations does, and then specific ways that you can get involved with this work. Leave the slide should advance. So just sort of the company line, if you will. The Office of Government Relations is a part of the church-wide staff, or the national staff of the Episcopal Church, which is based in New York, but we are actually located in Washington, D.C., so that we can engage in meetings with the U.S. federal government. We're tasked with representing the policy positions of the church to the U.S. federal government, and what's helpful to know about those policy positions is that they come through General Convention and Executive Council exclusively. It's getting a little bit, for non-church nerds, that might just sound like some jargon, but essentially what it means is the elected bodies of the church are actually the ones that create and then vote on the policies that we represent. So myself, the staff that I work with, under Presiding Bishop Michael Curry, we do not come up with the policies ourselves. We are just tasked with representing them. And we do focus, or are tasked primarily with advocacy to the U.S. federal government, even though certainly local and state level advocacy is important as well. And we also recognize, and I'll talk a bit more about this toward the end, that the Episcopal Church is actually present in 17 different nations, but we do not do advocacy directly to those other governments. But we do rely on international connections. I think I was reading through y'all's website. You have relationships with Bolivia, Tanzania, and Honduras in some form. But we will reach out to parts of the Anglican Communion, parts of the Episcopal Church, to draw on their expertise, their voices, when we are advocating on foreign policy issues to the US government. As a part of the Office of Government Relations, we run the Episcopal Public Policy Network, which most people, if you've heard of one of the two, that's the one you're going to hear about. And it is our church-facing sort of grassroots network to engage the church in policy advocacy. You can follow us on social media at the EPPN. I'll have information about that later on and can certainly share it in a follow-up after the presentation. That's sort of the gist of our office. It was started by General Convention in the late 1970s, kind of took its current form in 1980, 81. And currently we're the smallest that it's actually ever been since that time. There are 5 full-time staff, but we work in coalition with a lot of other faith-based advocacy organizations. So most mainline denominations and other faith groups also have advocacy offices here in DC that do very similar work. We're not always going to be in agreement with them, but we can work together when we are, and share information, share expertise, and really sort of embody the word relation or relations in our office's title. To the next slide. My monitor is off to the side. So one piece to note, which was actually part of our strategy along the way anyway, but in the last General Convention in 2018, we were actually directed explicitly to work with bipartisan efforts in Congress whenever possible, and intentionally engage with elected officials and career government officials from all political parties. We view this as, and we're instructed in this way, as being more effective in ultimately creating change in the government. And that, is particularly true as we're in an election year, which happens every 2 years. Nationwide, you have changes in who's going to be in the government. And so to maintain relationships across all political parties through transitions is really important to the long-term success of our work, and the long-term ability for the Episcopal Church to sort of present itself, not just as, a voice to say vote yes or vote no, but really as a resource to say, how can our ministries, how can the knowledge that we have, the expertise that we have be of use to what our government works on. And I also want to speak about advocacy in the context of perhaps this summer, although beyond the summer, but thinking about all of the protesting that we have been seeing across the country in different cities, mostly focused on racial justice and specifically police violence and police brutality. And I wanted to share a quote from an op-ed that President Obama wrote on Medium. And he talks about this sort of parallel universes of activism and the need for that to educate people, to generate energy, but ultimately the need to translate that into the parallel work of advocacy and getting more specific and more detailed. And he says, eventually aspirations have to be translated into specific laws and institutional practices. And in a democracy, that only happens when we elect government officials who are responsive to our demands. And he speaks to both the need to be specific in those demands so that we understand the complexities of the issues that Congress is working on, that the federal government is working on, and connecting it to the act of voting as well. And that another form, not just speaking out in between and holding elected officials accountable, but when we're given the opportunity to vote, to actually exercise that right as a means of looking after one another, of picking candidates who we believe have policies that reflect our values and will ultimately lead to the success that we want to see in the country. So sort of backing out a little bit, I want to focus on why we advocate to the government. This is usually sort of a discussion time I have when I do this in person, but since we can't be in person, I'll just kind of move forward lecture style. And there's 3 specific reasons that I want to highlight for why we advocate to the government, and the federal government in particular. The first is scripture. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute. There are numerous examples in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Gospels of speaking truth to power, of speaking out, of engaging in our common life, as ways to practice our Christianity out, our faith out in the world. So there is a scriptural basis for doing this. There's not necessarily a scriptural basis, to get in more detail than that, to say, okay, well, which piece of legislation is the right one to vote for? How can we, what does scripture tell us about that? But scripture can inform us with the values and the underlying inspiration needed to step out and be a voice in the public square. The second reason why we advocate, again, especially to the federal government, is scale. And the federal government can act on a scale that churches simply can't on their own. So as one example, only 5% of food assistance within the US comes from a charitable organization, and the federal government provides the funding for the other 95%. So the charitable organization means all secular nonprofits, all faith-based nonprofits, all of that, which is amazing work. It's great work. It can only reach about 5% of what is provided in domestic food assistance. So if we as a church want to, increase the impact that we have, beyond our soup kitchens, beyond our homeless ministries, if we want to add to that, advocacy is a way to do that at scale. And it's a complementary way, going back to sort of the hands-on and advocacy, parallel that President Obama had mentioned. It's a way to complement the work that we're already doing in our outreach ministries. The third reason to advocate to the federal government is authority. And I think this is my favorite one, or at least the one that is the most interesting. And it's that the federal government has authorities that no other entity has. And if we as a church want to speak out on those issues or have influence on those issues, we have to engage the federal government in order to do so. The same can be said for state and local governments in some cases as well. But three examples at the federal government are immigration and refugee policy, foreign policy, and environmental regulation. So I'll drill down into maybe one example. The Episcopal Church runs one of 9 refugee resettlement agencies. It's called Episcopal Migration Ministries, for those who aren't familiar with it. And there are thousands of Episcopalians who support that work. They donate to the work of resettling refugees. They may actually provide in-kind services like picking refugees up from the airport, helping them get settled in housing, connecting them to schools for children for families that have children, providing English lessons. There are a lot of tangible ways that Episcopalians are involved in that ministry, but none of it could happen if the federal government did not maintain a refugee resettlement program. So if we want to keep that going, we have to advocate for that at the federal level. In this current administration, the Trump administration, we're actually seeing an unprecedented attack on, I don't really like using that word very much, but it really is a systematic attack on the refugee resettlement program that really doesn't match either the Republican or the Democratic Party historically. In fact, Republican presidential administrations, and it's the president that has the authority to set the number of refugees that can be allowed in. Republican presidential administrations have actually allowed more refugees in than Democratic presidential administrations. But it's something that has had historically for decades bipartisan support very strongly, and it's something that the Episcopal Church has been involved in since around World War II. So it's a really old ministry for the church. It's an old program, widely supported program within the government. And so ultimately, again, if we want to have an influence over that and keep that program going, we have to be engaging with the federal government to do so. So I want to shift gears a little bit and get into some more civic pieces, and not just sort of take a break from issues. One is civil discourse. It sounds like you all are familiar with that, which is wonderful. We have a civil discourse curriculum that's available online. I was sort of the primary writer and creative director, if you will, for that. But it's a church that curriculum we did in relationship with Church Next. So it's kind of like a masterclass program where there are videos and interactive modules and discussion boards online. And it covers these sort of 5 different themes. What is civil discourse and how does it fit into all of this? How is it different than civility writ large? We go through tenets for civil discourse. How do we build sort of this internal capacity for engaging in dialogue with one another, especially on difficult issues? And then values-based conversations. How do we remember that we should acknowledge, recognize, and be explicit about the values that support our positions? We think we find that people have difficulty engaging in conversation because they jump too soon and too quickly into sort of partisan talking points. And they miss this pause, this acknowledgement of what we have in common. An simplified example I like to use for that is healthcare. And the fact that I think the vast majority of people share the value of wanting the country, wanting people to have the best access to the best healthcare possible. But we often don't pause and acknowledge that, and we go right into the debate over to what extent the government should be involved in that, which is a genuine debate. It's a genuine conversation that can and needs to happen and continue to happen. But when we forget, that commonality, the basis that we have in a shared value, I think, start to diminish and simplify the other. So that's what the values-based conversations is about. There's the complexities of policy that talks about, policy isn't a clear-cut process. Sometimes we don't know what the right answer is, and sometimes we think we do, and then it turns out that what we thought was right ended up creating a bigger problem in the end. And then thinking about all of this as sort of a sacred space for debate, the holiness, the opportunity that exists in our diversity of perspectives. And I personally find this compelling for the Episcopal Church in particular, which of many Christian denominations in the United States, the membership of the Episcopal Church actually more closely reflects the broader American public in terms of political party affiliation. So it's a really pretty balanced church in terms of Republicans and Democrats, according to Pew Research. And so I think that's an opportunity for us as a church to engage each other and engage our communities in richer conversations and kind of work against this, the difficulty that we're having, the animosity that we're seeing regarding political conversations. And I want to share this quote on this topic from Dr. King, which is about conversations surrounding the Vietnam War. And I find this quote inspiring, but also very challenging. And he said, "Here's the true meaning and value of compassion and nonviolence. When it helps us to see the enemy's point of view, to hear his questions, to know of his assessment of ourselves. For from his view, we may indeed see the basic weaknesses of our own condition. And if we are mature, we may learn and grow and profit from the wisdom of the brothers who are called the opposition." And, it's inspiring because to me, it says, okay, value, how do we be compassionate in this moment? How do we be compassionate when there's such division? And it's challenging because it says and implies there's something to learn from the other, even if we call them the opposition. And I find that, I don't know, motivational. So I hope that you do as well. And we try to embody this approach in a way in our advocacy work. Turning then from civil discourse, sort of this, how do we engage in conversations, to something that is particularly relevant in 2020, and that's our election engagement and vote faithfully work. So Presiding Bishop Curry said, I think it was last summer when he was preaching at the Union of Black Episcopalians conference, and said, getting souls to the polls isn't just about casting our own vote, but about working together so that we all can vote and vote faithfully. And really he emphasized this idea that, voting is an act of participating in our common life together. It's an act of looking out for one another. It's not about saying who you should vote for. That's not something that the church is involved in. We don't tell you who to vote for or who to vote against, whether that's a candidate or a political party. But we can talk about, what is it like to engage in conversation on our values? What is it like to discuss these difficult issues that are being brought up again in debates and the media in the lead up to an election as we compare candidates? And how can we thoughtfully reflect on that and make sure that we then follow through on our responsibilities to vote if we have the right to do so? Because doing so is using our voice. It's a form of power that we can have to positively impact our community. And so we've been doing a lot of voter engagement through this time, despite even with all of the craziness of COVID-19 that it has brought. And one of the key pieces we're emphasizing between now and election day is this plan your vote, or make your My Voter plan, so that you know how you're going to vote. By that, I don't mean who you're voting for. I literally mean what is the process you're going to go through to cast your vote this year. it may look very different, and there are a lot of things to consider this time around. And so we want to emphasize that people take the time to think about that process and make sure they're prepared to do it in a timely fashion, in a way that is safe for them in terms of protecting yourself from coronavirus, if that is something that is a particular risk for you. And so, it's really a sort of a 5-step process. The first is registration, making sure you're registered to vote. And all of these processes, starting with registration, are going to vary by state. So all of you are, of course, I'm assuming all of you are in Georgia. So you really only need to look to the processes that are in Georgia for this. But know the registration process, even check your registration status. So one of the issues that we've been seeing around the country are voter roll purges. I find that a bit of an extreme word, but essentially names being taken off voter registration lists. And there are certainly, I think, abuses of that, but it is also a necessary practice to remove names of people who have moved, of people who have died. It's sort of kind of standard maintenance in a way, but there are, again, times of abuse and just errors in it. So make sure with the registration process, you double check that you're registered to vote. The second step will be to research who will be on your ballot. It's important to know that, yes, it's the presidential election year, but there are also a lot of congressional seats that are up for re-election and a lot of state and local races as well. I should have looked this up actually before I did this presentation, and maybe someone can let me know in the group chat if Georgia does ballot initiatives. But some states will actually have ballot initiatives where the public actually votes on an issue that's written out on the ballot itself. If Georgia has those, y'all you know what you're talking about. You know what I'm talking about. If you've never seen it before, then maybe that seems strange. In North Carolina, I remember voting on several of them. Step 3 and step 4 kind of go together and is where there's a choice for you more so in this election than there has been in the past. And that is to either request an absentee ballot or vote by mail, or make a plan to vote in person. I believe Georgia has allowed no excuse absentee ballot requests during this election. And that is to accommodate for people who are concerned about the risk of COVID-19 and coronavirus, who don't want to go in person and want to minimize their exposure. And so that's a really critical piece to know about and opportunities to know about, but you've got to pay attention to deadlines. When is the deadline to request the absentee ballot? When do you need to return it and how? And for some people, even the postage can be a barrier. So there are places where drop-off boxes are in place, and sometimes that can vary by district or county, not just by state, in terms of the availability of drop boxes for ballots. So that's something to be aware of in terms of absentee ballot requests. Voting in person, of course, can be early voting, or it could be voting on election day itself. So looking at early voting deadlines and opportunities can actually minimize the risk of exposure for people to COVID-19, because it can spread out the population who are coming to vote in person over a larger number of days. And so that's something we have been advocating on, at least at the federal level, is encouraging Congress to kind of put pressure on secretaries of state in each state to make some of those changes. Once, of course, you cast your vote, and sort of throughout this process, helping others to vote as well is step number 5, and helping to get out the vote, encouraging friends and family to do it, speaking through your church, through the parish as well, and saying, hey, here's a reminder, this deadline is coming up. Really want to make sure if you're wanting to vote by mail, to go ahead and do that. And there are some surrounding concerns, I understand, regarding vote by mail and its safety. Is it the right way forward? And that's something we have been advocating for to an extent to the federal government. So most of the time, or with most election issues, it's really handled on a state-by-state basis, and the federal government does not get involved very often. But we have seen an opportunity because of the budget constraints from the economic downturn and the response to COVID-19, that states' budgets are really hit pretty hard this year. And so there are less resources in some places to invest in what's the what's needed to shift to a larger number of mail-in ballots. And so we have been advocating it for federal support through grants to states. It has not moved forward. I'm not sure that it will between now and the election. But part of that is to look at how do we make sure the ballots can be counted quickly and efficiently, because most states cannot start counting absentee ballots until election day itself. So one of the concerns really, or one of the ways to mitigate, I think, the concerns ahead of this election are to talk more openly and honestly about our expectations for getting the results of the election. Mail-in balloting or mail-in voting is not shown to benefit either the Republican or the Democratic Party. That's shown across the country. There are states that have already shifted to all mail-in voting even before the pandemic. Some of those states lean to the right, some lean to the left. All of them seem to have done it fairly successfully. But it does take time, and especially for states that aren't used to counting that number of ballots, it's going to mean delayed results. And I think I'm concerned about that for the presidential election, certainly, but I think it's something to watch out for congressional races as well. That if they're very close, it may get heated and people may start to question, what's going on. But ultimately, it does not mean that the system is breaking down. It doesn't mean that there's fraud. It's just we've got to prepare ourselves that election night, we may not know who wins. And that can be okay. Open to other questions about that. There are a lot of different ways I can go with mail-in ballots. So please do get questions in for the Q&A section, but I'll move on a little bit quicker to get through the material that I have. We have a Vote Faithfully toolkit available online, which has a lot of this information spelled out in it, ways that you can engage other people, help get out the vote, registration drives, mobilizing in your community, communicating about it, and then voter advocacy as well, which will often take place at a state level rather than federal level, but you can see what the Episcopal Church's policy positions are on voting. One other or two other things to note that are on this slide. The first is probably more significant than the stickers that you can order. But becoming a poll worker is something that is critical in every election. There are hundreds of thousands of people who serve as poll workers. That not every state uses that term, but that seems to be the most prevalent, to help that election just function, making sure people know where to vote, checking people in, directing people through the polling places. And we have seen already in primaries across the country, including in Georgia, a shortage of poll workers who have not signed up or have not shown up because of concerns of coronavirus. Many of those people are generally retired and in a higher risk category because of their age or other reasons. And so we're really encouraging, with the caveat of the risk of coronavirus, really encouraging people to sign up to be poll workers this year, especially people who are younger, who are not in a higher risk category. I've not seen any case where a precinct is not providing personal protective equipment to these people, and in most cases it is also a paid position. So you get paid for the hours that you are actually in serving as the poll worker, and then some states, everyone has to go through poll worker training, which I think is like an afternoon in most cases. Some states will also pay you for the time that it takes to do that training. So it's something that's accessible. I have signed up to do it here in PG County, Prince George's County, Maryland. I don't know if I've been selected yet, but I'm looking forward to it. I've never done it before, and it's really interesting, an interesting opportunity. And I think it's something I personally have not thought much of. I mean, I knew people did it. I've talked to people in the Episcopal Church who are super passionate about it. I bring up elections and they get excited. Hey, I've been a poll worker for 40 years. And I love it. And so I think this is an awesome opportunity for civic engagement, for talking across generations, for talking about what it means to participate in our democracy, even beyond voting, but actually facilitating the process of voting. So I really encourage you all to check that out. If that is of interest to you, looking at youth college ministries as well as sources for poll workers this year. We also have this little graphic that's up here. I'm an Episcopalian and I voted. We have stickers, magnets, and pens available. If you all would like any, you can email us. Also this year is the 2020 census. So I have argued at the beginning of the year that this was more important than the presidential or than this year's election, despite all of the anxiety around it. And I still say that the 2020 census is more important than the election. It is every 10 years, the count of the population within the United States. It's not a count of the citizens, it's a count of the people who are residing here. And we have been an official partner with the US Census Bureau for the 2020 census. I've absolutely loved working with them. And it's just so critical to all that we advocate for. It's critical to our communities. It's not just important for the apportionment process, so how many seats in the House each state gets based on their population, but over 130 federal programs use census data for effective and efficient implementation. And then state and local governments use census data as well. So for example, the school district, how many 7-year-olds are going to be needing school buses 7 years from now? The census data is going to inform that. So it's just critical across the board, even for private businesses that use this data to inform their operations and where they're going to invest. An undercount or an inaccurate count, which generally is undercounted, can be the difference between getting a target or not. If Target's threshold is a certain number, for example, maybe Target doesn't want to move to build a store in a certain community because their population doesn't meet that threshold according to the census data. But if it were done accurately, maybe they would. So there are a lot of reasons to make sure that there's an accurate count with this census. And really simple and easy to do. You have until September 30th to fill it out. If you have not done so yet, that's when the data collection period will be over. That's another topic that I could go down a rabbit hole on, but I'll kind of stop there, recognizing I only have a couple of minutes. So I'm going to try to go through a few more slides very quickly and then open it up to Q&A. So another way to kind of get involved in our office is to sign up for our action alerts through the Episcopal Public Policy Network. These are opportunities to take action on topics that we are advocating on as staff and that we're encouraging the church to advocate on. All of these are backed by Episcopal Church policy. And so you can know that that's the underlying basis of it. We provide links to the church policies that support those positions, and then additional material as well, and send those out about once a week. The policy areas that we cover, again, this is very quick, sort of the larger areas or buckets, if you will, are creation care in the environment, ending poverty domestically and internationally, migration, refugees and immigration, human rights and peace building, and then racial reconciliation. And I think this might be where I'm going to stop for now, but racial reconciliation we look at as like a lens to the other issues rather than its own standalone policy piece. There are not necessarily a lot of policy issues that you can say, okay, this is racial reconciliation, but there are elements to others that have racial justice implications. One example would be, the racial justice implications of immigration policies, or the disproportionate, who's bearing the disproportionate burden from environmental pollution to anti-poverty programs as well. So that's sort of how we approach racial reconciliation in these policy areas. I'm going to skip forward to the contact information slide as we switch to Q&A. Does that work? Awesome. So really appreciate that. It's a lot of information in 30 minutes. Hopefully it was engaging and drew out some questions for you.
Thank you. Okay, let me unmute there. That took me a second. Thank you, Alan. There are so many things that come to my mind as I listen to the work that you do, and your the Episcopal Public Policy Network. I think it's really fascinating. Not easy for me to say, but really fascinating work. I was going to ask if Carlton, do you want to? I guess we should, do we want to leave that up for a minute, and then we should probably stop the screen?
Stop the share, yeah.
There we go.
Alan, there's one question that I have at the moment, and that has to do with what are the resources or common sites that one could visit to research candidates at various levels, national, state, local?
Sure, it's a good question. And while I am slowly answering the question, I'm going to pull up a resource to drop in the chat if that's helpful. So we've created this Plan Your Vote resource here, which includes links that go through the 5 steps that I mentioned. So registration, researching who's on your ballot, requesting an absentee ballot, voting in person, and then helping others to vote. So there is a particular tool, it's ballotready.org, and I will pull that up as well. There are a couple of different websites out there. Some get updated sort of more quickly than others as more information is added. But that's the one that I have found reasonably effective. Sometimes, and it's up to the candidates, if I remember correctly, sometimes their personal information is not very filled out. So you might just see a name and no bio, and might have to do a little bit of digging on who the person is. That's especially true for local races and even some state races. But the ballotready.org can be a starting point for that.
We have another question in a rather broad sense, and that is everything going bad? What is going right in our society from our perspective?
Sure. I mean, I think part of our approach between now and the election, at least, is to focus on the processes that are already in place, even with adjustments that are functioning. There are certainly still issues with voter suppression in different states and different areas that would have been there regardless of the pandemic, that need to be addressed and need to be worked on. But overall, the vast majority of the system is still set up to work correctly. The number of, or the percentage of people who have been voting by mail has actually increased every year for several decades. It's still fairly low, I think, in states that do not have all mail voting. So that's like Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and there's another one. So for all of the others, it's about 21% of people who will vote absentee or by mail. Of course, we expect that to go up, but there are still systems in place that are working. And, there've been, I think, some reasonable anxiety around what's happening with the Postal Service, not just related to delivering ballots on time, but delivering medications and other important things as well. But ultimately, it comes down to just making sure that you get the ballot in time, that you request it in time, that you fill it out with the postage on it and get it returned in time. I'm hoping that, there won't be a lot of issues as we get, to election day and a couple of days after regarding that. But it is still there. The Postal Service is still functioning. Some of the budgetary issues that were brought up about the Postal Service are legitimate, but they're not timed with this election. They really will be problematic into the summer next year, and will need to be addressed, but it's not related to the election necessarily. And like any election year, Congress always gets really, really slow. I mean, people aren't going to take risky votes right ahead of an election. That's typical. I think, it's especially challenging, though I can't say that word tonight, particularly challenging in the midst of the pandemic and the need for further economic response to coincide with that moment. So that discourages me a bit, but I don't think that it's necessarily abnormal. It's sort of par for the course, and it's something that is not unique to either political party either.
Okay. Another question is, what are some examples of the of faith groups cooperating or working together on advocacy initiatives?
Yeah, so I think that's maybe my second favorite part of the work that our office does, and sort of why I think the Episcopal Church should have an office like this. Most other denominations and faith groups have an advocacy office. And again, some of them will sort of focus on particular issues. I mean, our office is certainly a multi-issue office, as you saw, but we try to lean into the particular value add the Episcopal Church can bring to the advocacy space. A couple of those are international connections through the Anglican Communion and influencing foreign policy and trying to be not just, again, someone saying vote yes, vote no, but someone saying, we're here as a resource. We can get you connected to people in Tanzania. We can get you connected to people in Central America. And then in the areas where we don't have that expertise, we look to the other faith groups for that. So the Quaker organization, the Quakers, relatively small Christian denomination, have an advocacy office of about 55 staff. So it's just enormous. And they have 3 people focusing just on criminal justice reform. So we've worked and relied pretty heavily on them to track what's happening in Congress, to give advice. I mean, ultimately, we're always comparing this to what our church policies say. So it's not like we're just accepting their position as our own. But we can work with them and rely and coordinate with them in that policy space. We've also worked with the Southern Baptists Advocacy Office, Southern Baptist Convention's Advocacy Office on a number of issues. There are places where we absolutely do not agree with them, but there are areas where we do. And having that political diversity, or sort of assumed political diversity, if you rather, can be an asset, because it can help us get connected to offices in both major political parties, and help us fulfill that, push to work in a bipartisan way.
Okay. Very topical question, having to do with voter suppression. Is it on the rise, and what does it look like? And would you consider it to be a problem?
It is a problem, and it's a problem, again, that will look different in each state, and is sometimes, I think, more explicit than other places. So it generally surrounds access to the polls as sort of one aspect of it. So how many in-person voting areas are being closed, and who is that unique to a particular demographic that lives in certain areas, geographic areas. So rural areas can be problematic for rural areas as well as in cities. So in the rural area, that would look like, well, the polling place is too far. I can't get there. There's no public transportation. In cities, it can look like there are too many people and there are not enough sites to actually vote. And that, of course, is an added concern this year with the risk of coronavirus in terms of health safety. There are also, I think, criminal justice elements to voter suppression as well, and people being disenfranchised because they are getting caught up in the criminal justice system in ways that are not fair. And then another issue I think I mentioned earlier are these voter roll purges, which again, it is standard practice. That in and of itself is not bad. But when that's abused, when people are just taken off really for no reason, that can really lead to people, missing voter registration deadlines because they thought they were registered, and then not being able to vote in the election. So there are a lot of different ways that it can take shape. Some also point to postage itself and access to postage as one barrier to voting, especially as we look to increasing mail-in voting this year. The Postal Service still maintains the policy for now to deliver any election mail, regardless of whether or not it has postage on it, even though that may not be the explicitly written policy in a given state. So you are supposed to put postage in most places. Some states will pay for the postage, but you are supposed to put postage on it in order for it to be delivered. But that is seen as a barrier as well.
Okay. Another question is, as an Episcopalian, how should my decision-making process be unique as I attempt to vote my values?
How should it be unique? I mean, I think the policy positions that we rely on in our advocacy, serve a function in that way. They provide a basis for us to say, okay, what are we saying to our legislators, to the federal government on X, Y, or Z issue. But I think they can also be a means of personal reflection and education of what has the church said on these issues. What have Episcopalians from across the country? We have one of the larger elected bodies in our General Convention that actually formed 4 years before the U.S. Congress. What has that body said on these issues, and how can I use that to potentially inform my vote? What does Scripture say? How can I listen more deeply to sermons, to readings on Sundays between now and the election, and how can that inform who I vote for, what I look for in a candidate? I think to draw actually another element from the civil discourse curriculum to apply to this question, in the values exercise, we don't just talk about people, we share values, great, or we don't share values, maybe not as great, but it's a reality. We also rank values differently, and so it doesn't mean that what it means sort of in practice is that positions don't have to be mutually exclusive of one another. I can say, I really want to prioritize support for veterans. That is really important for me. And I also support refugee resettlement. That doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. It's not like one makes me vote against or not support the other. And so that's another thing to keep in mind, is just how do I weigh my values? What significance do I put towards them? And how is that reflected in the candidates that are before me? It's not an easy process. Especially as, again, presidential election is important, but there are all sorts of different offices up for open in this election year. So applying those to the other candidates is a process. It's time consuming.
Well, last question is, who controls how many polling sites there are in our state, for example?
So I think that varies by district. I'm not 100% confident on that answer. I think that varies by, it can vary by county or polling district. And it all should be under the purview of the Secretary of State for each state. And so I don't know what the particulars are for Georgia. I do know we haven't promoted this publicly yet, but one of the recommendations we've heard and one of the coalitions we're in is to urge churches that generally have large open spaces, urge churches to proactively volunteer their spaces to be a polling site, to kind of not overwhelm in the sense of we want the system to break down because of the requests, but to just say, like, we are here, there should not be an excuse of not having enough space. Okay, you're shutting down this polling site because people can't social distance in it. That makes sense. Here is our parish hall. So there are ways to actually kind of be proactively involved in that. And again, I think that speaks to the relational element between the church and the state, and how we can work together to make our common life happen.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Alan. Thanks for addressing these questions as honestly as I guess you could have.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate it.
Sure. Over to you, Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlton, for managing that. We had a lot of questions, and it brings up a lot of interesting information. So thanks, Alan, for kind of walking us through some of that. I'm sure we'll have other things come up in our discussions. I think now, hopefully I'm not forgetting anything
that I wanted to share this evening. Lord God, in this world where goodness and evil continue to clash with each other, instill in us and in all people discernment to see what is right, faith to believe what is right, and courage to do what is right. Keep us and preserve us, body, mind, and soul. Amen.
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 Thank you,
Thank you all for
everybody.
being here.
Thank
Good
you.
to
Well, I
be
was
with
just
you.
going to
Alan,
start,
Thank
Michelle.
y'all.
Alan, thank
Bye.
you again for a great presentation.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank
It's good to be
you.
with you.
Learned Thank you very much.
I
And
Thank
think
you.
Lee had something
reminder-
to say.
Oh, I was going to say, just a reminder, our next meeting is October 13th on Tuesday night.
Okay.
And we'll be talking about church numbers, I guess, encouraging or reversing church decline. So why are our numbers of really all denominations decreasing, and what we can do to bring them back up? So thank you guys so much for coming. We appreciate it. Thank you,
A
Alan.
special thank you to Alan for being here.
Yes,
y'all.
thank you. Yay.
Learning.
Wear your mask.
Please be safe. Yeah.
Y'all take care.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Have a good evening.
Good night.